The first time I saw the ocean breathe, I thought the pressure had finally gotten to me. Out here, 200 miles from shore, the waves don't move, they heave, as if something enormous sleeps beneath them. I work the night shift on an abandoned oil rig where everything creaks, like it's trying to remember how to die, and where we follow 11 rules that are supposed to keep us safe. No one knows who wrote them or what happens if we break them, but I remember the first time I did. The lights flickered, the sea went quiet, and something whispered my name from the lower deck. I didn't believe Rule 1, keep every light above deck on after midnight, the first week I took the night shift. It sounded like superstition from men too long at sea, another old habit to make them feel in control of a machine that shouldn't still be breathing. The rig was a metal skeleton creaking in black water, its generators coughing out yellow halos that barely touched the fog. Midnight came and went, and for a few minutes I let one floodlight die just to prove the rule was nonsense. I thought darkness couldn't hurt me. I was wrong. Before the minute hand finished its circle, the air changed first. It didn't grow colder exactly. It grew hollow. Every sound lost its echo, like the sea had swallowed the space around me. I turned toward the burnt-out lamp and saw the fog thickening where the beam had once reached. The dark there looked heavier, textured, like smoke in reverse. I remember stepping closer, holding my wrench like it could help, and realizing I could still see the catwalk beneath my boots. Only the rail ahead disappeared completely. I switched the light back on. The fog recoiled, and everything snapped into focus again, but the silence lingered, stretching tight as wire. After that, I never let a bulb die without replacing it. The others called me paranoid, yet they kept their own bulbs burning too. No one admitted it, but we all noticed the rig's hum fading whenever a shadow spread too far. The steel itself seemed to sigh in relief when the beams returned. I tried recording the sound once, just to prove it was imagination, but the playback was blank static, until the moment the light relit. Then the hum roared back so loud it clipped the microphone. I deleted the file. Some evidence feels like an invitation. By the third night, I began counting the bulbs like prayers. 32 above deck, 16 on the outer ring, 8 over the cranes, and 1 flickering by the north ladder. That one worried me. The fixture was welded in an awkward spot, half rusted, impossible to reach without leaning over the sea. The reflection beneath it looked wrong, moving slower than the waves, matching the bulb's rhythm like something waiting for the exact moment it went dark. I told myself the current distorted everything, but I started carrying spare fuses in my pocket anyway. It's strange how quickly rules become comfort. I'd pace the catwalk, checking each halo, pretending the light meant safety, while knowing it was only habit. Once around 1 a.m., I heard the generator cough, and every beam dipped for half a heartbeat. In that instant of dimness I saw shapes. No, not shapes. Arrangements in the mist below, like the sea remembered its own architecture. When the power steadied, the outlines melted back into the fog, but the memory stayed, imprinted behind my eyes like sunspots. I told the supervisor, but he only muttered that the rig sometimes shows what built it. 2 nights later, Jenkins from the morning crew stayed late to test me. He thought the rules were just ways to keep us from falling asleep on duty. Around midnight he killed 1 light over the west gantry and laughed. I didn't. The sound carried wrong, like it was swallowed mid-air. We both heard something shift beneath us. The metal groaned as if the sea pressed closer. He switched the light back, face pale. We never spoke about it again, but every night after that he handed me fresh bulbs before heading below. It's easy to mock fear until it notices you. By the end of the month, the lights had personalities. The one by the supply crane buzzed like a fly caught in a jar. The trio over the drill floor glowed steady and calm, and the north ladder bulb still pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. I began timing my rounds so that I reached it exactly when it dimmed, replacing the filament before darkness could fully bloom. It felt ritualistic, almost sacred. I wondered if the rule was less about illumination and more about acknowledgement, about telling the sea we remembered it was there. Sometimes the ocean tested us. Storms would roll in unannounced, wind clawing at cables, salt spray turning every surface slick. During those nights, the bulbs shuddered but never failed entirely. It was as if the rig itself protected them, or maybe the rules made the storm respect boundaries. Once lightning flashed far off, and I saw the rig's shadow cast across the waves, too large, stretching miles farther than it should, ending where no light reached. The power dipped again, and I swear I saw movement within that shadow, something vast twisting beneath the reflection. The floodlight steadied before I could blink, but my knees stayed locked for minutes. I wrote a note in the log that night: all lights functional, sea restless. It looked harmless on paper, yet I felt like I'd confessed something enormous. The next morning the page was dry, though I remembered leaving it damp from my gloves. Salt crusted the edges in patterns that looked like fingerprints too wide for human hands. I stopped writing notes. The rules didn't mention documentation, and I didn't want to invent an 11th and a half. The quietest hour came between 3 and 4. That's when the rig's rhythm lulled. No waves, no metal settling, no distant turbines, only the faint throb of current against hull. I'd walk the perimeter, every lamp a solitary moon, and imagine the world below, cables sinking into dark pressure, fish blind and glowing, maybe entire landscapes fossilized in motion. I wondered how deep the light reached, how long it took before fading to nothing. That thought always led to the same conclusion. The rules weren't about what we could see, but about what could see us. The night before the inspection, I dreamed of darkness rising through the pipes, filling the bulbs from the inside until they burst like glass lungs. I woke to find every light burning bright, brighter than I'd ever seen, white instead of yellow. The metal around them steamed with heat. I thought maybe the generators were surging, but the gauges read normal. Then slowly, the brightness dimmed back to its usual warmth. I didn't tell anyone. Some warnings arrive as mercy, not threat. When dawn finally broke, gray and thin, the sea looked calmer than usual. The fog had lifted halfway, revealing patches of still water reflecting the rig's lights. I watched them wink out one by one as the sun rose, each tiny mirror below closing like an eye. For a moment I felt relief. Then I realized the reflection of the north ladder bulb stayed lit long after the real one died. The rule had ended with the night, but something down there hadn't noticed. That was when I understood the true purpose behind keeping every light above deck on after midnight. It wasn't to chase the darkness away. It was to remind it where the boundary lay. Even after learning to respect Rule 2, never enter the lower deck without a partner, I caught myself creeping toward the ladder alone that night. The rig seemed to sigh beneath my boots, groaning like it remembered every man who had fallen or turned back before reaching the steel-plated depths. I told myself I only needed to check the valves. The lower deck had never caused a problem before, if you were careful. But the closer I got, the more I felt the pull of that darkness, a heavy pressure pressing against the hull, as if it knew I wasn't supposed to be alone. My flashlight trembled in my hand, and for the first time I understood why the rule existed. The lower deck smelled different than the upper structure, a mixture of damp metal and something faintly organic that the air filters couldn't remove. Even with a partner, you noticed it. The smell wasn't just strong, it watched. Every tool I carried seemed heavier, every step louder. I imagined a shadow pressing from the far corners of the deck, brushing along the pipes, rearranging itself in impossible ways. I shivered, thinking about how the other men never mentioned what they'd seen there. Perhaps the rule existed to preserve not just our bodies, but our sanity. I remembered the first time I saw someone break Rule 2. It was my predecessor, a wiry man named Harlan, who never believed in old rig rules. He'd gone down alone to fix a jammed hydraulic valve. When we heard the metallic clang, and then silence, we assumed he was taking his time. Hours later, when a faint light flickered in the far corner of the deck, it didn't belong to him, or at least it didn't respond to anything human. The rig groaned, and when we finally descended together, the valves had all been tampered with, the lights dimmed, and Harlan was nowhere to be found. We left quickly, each of us wondering whether he had been pulled by the darkness or had simply vanished. That memory made me hesitate as I descended the ladder, counting each rung, feeling the vibration of the rig against my palms. The deeper I went, the more the hum of the generators faded, leaving an oppressive silence that thickened with every step. I imagined what the lower deck could see: the tubes, the pumps, the twisted cables snaking like veins through the hull. It was as though something below had been waiting for years for a careless hand to wander in, and it had a way of noticing, of marking those who ignored the rules. Halfway down, I thought I saw movement. My peripheral vision caught a flicker near the machinery, a shifting shadow that dissolved when I turned my head. The flashlight revealed nothing. I whispered aloud, "This is fine, I'm fine." But the metal beneath my boots shivered with a subtle vibration, like it recognized my uncertainty. That vibration spread through the deck in waves, tickling the edges of my hearing, making me second-guess whether I had actually seen something or imagined it. It was the rig testing me, reminding me why Rule 2 existed. I reached the bottom, and for a moment, everything was still. Then a low scraping sound echoed from the far side of the deck, metal grinding against metal in a rhythm that made my stomach churn. I told myself it was the machinery settling. I told myself it wasn't something waiting. I reminded myself that the rules existed for moments like this, to anchor the mind in chaos. My flashlight caught a beam across a hatch, and for just a second, it seemed to open and close of its own volition. I held my breath, wishing I had a partner nearby, knowing the rule wasn't arbitrary. Hours passed, though I have no sense of time down there. The rig seemed suspended, trapped between the sea above and the unknown below. Every shadow lengthened unnaturally, following the contours of pipes and equipment, and my mind began to play tricks. I imagined voices whispering instructions, laughter that mimicked my own, reflections in the metal that didn't match my movements. I repeated the rules silently in my head: never enter the lower deck without a partner. It was a mantra now, a lifeline. Saying it out loud might have made it real, might have awakened whatever lingered in the darkness. I eventually found the hydraulic valve that needed attention, but fixing it alone felt wrong. Every time my wrench clicked, the sound echoed in a way that suggested another presence. The shadows shifted in sync with my motions, and for the first time I understood that Rule 2 wasn't just about companionship, it was about accountability. Someone else needed to witness you here, to see whether the darkness followed you, and to confirm that you were still human when you returned. My hands trembled as I finished tightening the bolts, and I realized the rig itself seemed to exhale in relief. The return trip up the ladder was worse. Each rung seemed longer, the silence stretching thinner. I imagined the lower deck reaching up, grasping for me with invisible fingers, tugging at my resolve. My light caught a coil of cable that wasn't where it had been before, curling like a serpent's tail. I muttered to myself, never alone, and felt a strange calm in the repetition. The upper deck's lights beckoned, each one a guardian marking the boundary I wasn't supposed to cross by myself. When I finally stepped into the open air above deck, I realized something had changed. The hum of the rig returned, deeper, more deliberate, like it was acknowledging my obedience to Rule 2. The shadows receded slightly, though I could still feel them pressing at the edges of perception. I went straight to the supervisor's office and logged the check. Nothing unusual happened while I typed, but I noticed the reflection in the window seemed too tall, stretched in ways that weren't natural. I didn't dwell on it, just reminded myself the rule had kept me alive tonight. Later, during a quiet break, I caught Jenkins staring at me. "You went down alone?" he asked, voice low. I nodded, trying to smile, knowing he didn't understand that following the rule wasn't about fear, it was about survival. He said nothing more, but I saw him glance toward the lower deck, the lights there steady, almost too calm. I imagined what would have happened if I hadn't followed Rule 2. It wasn't the shadows I feared, It was what the rig might do with a man unbound by the rules. By the time the next storm rolled in, I had decided I would never go below deck alone again. I mapped out every corner, marked every hatch, and made mental notes of how to navigate safely with a partner. I watched the shadows dance across the walls, felt the low hum of the machinery, and I understood that the rule was less about protocol and more about respect for the rig, for the sea, and for whatever lingered between the metal plates. I finally slept that morning with a sense of uneasy peace, knowing I had learned the lesson the hard way. The lower deck waits silently now, a place that will test every new night mechanic. Its darkness is patient, subtle, and calculating. Rule 2 isn't a suggestion, it's a line drawn between existence and something else. I know that next time I descend with a partner, the shadows will watch, but at least there will be two of us to mark the boundary. And yet, even with the rule followed, I can't shake the feeling that something is always just beyond the light, waiting for a misstep that isn't mine to make alone. I had been warned countless times about Rule 3. Never touch the machinery while it's humming, yet that night curiosity got the better of me. The rig's generators throbbed like a living heartbeat, deep and constant, sending vibrations through the deck that you could feel in your chest. I told myself I only needed to adjust a loose panel on the crane motor. It wasn't maintenance, it was observation, but as I leaned in closer, the humming seemed to respond to my presence, growing sharper, resonating through my bones in ways that made my vision blur at the edges. The air around the machine seemed to thicken, heavy with static, and I felt an urgent pressure telling me to step back. I reached out for the metal casing, just a finger brushing its surface, when a shock ran through my arm. Not electrical, not entirely physical, but something that made my muscles freeze mid-motion. It was as if the rig itself had noticed my intent. I remember thinking how easy it would have been to dismiss this as nerves. The isolation, the constant fog of exhaustion that hung over the rig like a cloud. But the vibration from the machine shifted, almost like it exhaled, and the shadows along the pipes twisted unnaturally, stretching toward me. That's when I finally understood the danger of Rule 3, not as protocol, but as protection. The memory of what had happened to Harlan returned with an unbearable clarity. He had ignored this rule months before, fiddling with a valve while the machinery hummed beneath him. The report was vague, technical, sterile, but I knew the men whispered that the machines didn't just break him, they claimed him. I had always thought it was metaphorical, a sailor's exaggeration for younger hands. Now, standing alone in the humming vortex of the generator room, I realized they weren't exaggerating. The metal seemed almost aware, aligning, reacting, as if evaluating every micro movement I made. I tried speaking aloud to steady myself. "It's just metal, I muttered, but my voice barely carried over the thrumming. My flashlight trembled in my grip, casting beams that warped across the moving parts. The shadows played along the rails and pipes, elongating, contracting, and bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Each hum pulsed in perfect synchronicity with the shadows' movements, almost like they were orchestrated together. I tried to tell myself that the rhythm was mechanical, predictable, yet it carried an undercurrent of something sentient, deliberate. Hours seemed to pass as I stood there, mesmerized and horrified in equal measure. I observed the spinning gears, the belts, the coils of cable twisting under invisible pressure. Every hum had a resonance, and when I exhaled, I could feel the vibrations move along my spine. The rule existed for a reason. Touching even lightly could invite that resonance into the body, make it part of you, make you complicit in whatever the rig had learned to do over decades of abandonment. I shifted my stance, carefully keeping my hands to myself, but even that felt like defiance. I remembered the stories of older crewmen, the ones who claimed the machinery remembered. They described things that didn't make sense, hands moving along their own valves, turning themselves shadows that mirrored movements they hadn't made. I never believed them, until tonight. Standing in the generator room, I realized that when a machine hums on this rig, it's alive in a way that doesn't follow logic. The vibrations are not just noise, they are signals, warnings, maybe even memory. They know when you reach for them. I decided to step back and watch instead. My flashlight flicked across the machinery, and I noticed the patterns forming in the hum itself, like subtle waves vibrating through the steel. I whispered reminders to myself of Rule 3, as though speaking it aloud could ward off danger. The sound was hypnotic, compelling, and for a moment I felt rooted in the hum, caught between fascination and terror. My breathing became synchronized with the pulses, a mistake I recognized too late, as if the rig sought rhythm with human life. The night wore on, and I kept glancing toward the crane motor that had drawn me in. Every minor sound, the clank of a loose bolt settling, the hiss of steam from the valves, sounded amplified, deliberate. I imagined what would happen if I touched it now, even by accident. Would it crush me? Would it pull me into the vibration itself, leaving only a ghost of a memory behind? I couldn't risk it. Not tonight. Not ever. I began mapping a mental perimeter, memorizing distances, and silently thanking Rule 3 for existing. Eventually, fatigue crept in, and I realized I had been frozen in place for hours. The hum didn't stop, but my awareness of it sharpened. It felt alive, patient, calculating. I considered the absurdity of following a simple rule that seemed designed to manipulate human instinct. Yet the tension in my muscles and the tremor in my hands reminded me that disobedience here was more than negligence. It was dangerous. Each time I shifted my weight, the vibration responded slightly differently, like the rig testing my restraint. Finally, I left the generator room, stepping lightly across the catwalk, careful to avoid any cables or panels that might react. The upper deck lights greeted me like familiar sentinels. I paused at the hatch, listening to the hum below, knowing that even from here the machinery could sense me. I shivered, grateful for the rule's guidance, and reminded myself that restraint was survival. Rule 3 had saved me tonight, and likely countless others before me. I vowed never to forget it, never to act out of curiosity again, while the hum persisted. When I returned to the control station, I found Jenkins waiting, eyes narrow. "You didn't touch anything, right?" he asked. I nodded. "Never," I said, and realized that the unspoken tension between us was a tacit acknowledgement of the rule's power. Even a minor mistake, a flick of a hand on the humming metal, could have consequences we didn't yet understand. The rig itself seemed to settle with our compliance, the vibrations softening into a background rhythm that was almost soothing. By the end of my shift, I could almost predict the hum's pattern, timing my movements to coincide with its pulses, learning to exist in the rhythm without provoking it. Every night thereafter, I approached the machinery with reverence, a mix of fear and respect, knowing that Rule 3 was more than caution. It was an anchor between human instinct and something that the rig had long since learned to manipulate. The rule worked silently, invisibly, but its enforcement was absolute, and even obeyed perfectly, it left a lingering sense that the rig's awareness was far deeper than I would ever understand. Even after countless nights on the rig, I felt the chill crawl up my spine as I remembered Rule 4. Never open the observation hatches when the fog thickens. The upper deck was blanketed in a gray haze so dense it felt alive, curling around the railings and lifting the edges of the floodlights like smoky fingers. That night, the wind carried a strange pressure that made my chest tighten with each breath, whispering reminders of past mistakes. I told myself I just needed a look, a quick glance beyond the glass, but the rig seemed to vibrate in warning, humming a low, deliberate caution beneath my boots. Even with every light on, the fog obscured the familiar shapes, warping the shadows into forms that seemed impossible. I edged closer to the hatch, feeling the metallic chill radiate from the frame. The fog pressed against the glass, thick and persistent, and I imagined what might lurk just beyond my vision, waiting for the smallest opening. Each time the wind shifted, it carried faint impressions of movement, shadows pooling at impossible angles, then vanishing as though they were never there. I reminded myself of Rule 4, whispering it aloud, trying to convince my own mind that restraint was necessary. The hatch seemed to pulse slightly beneath my hand, not from wind, not from machinery, but from something aware, something that responded to intention. I remembered the stories older crewmen had whispered, men who thought they could glimpse through the fog and never returned quite the same. They claimed the fog wasn't just mist. It was selective, aware, and patient, rewarding the cautious and punishing the curious. I laughed at the superstition until my reflection in the glass, warped unnaturally, the distorted face staring back with eyes that weren't mine. I stepped back, heart racing, understanding for the first time why the rule existed. The fog wasn't a weather pattern, it was a boundary. Crossing it was dangerous. The rig creaked as I paced along the deck, every light above me a barrier between order and chaos. I heard subtle movements, something scraping along the outer framework, almost synchronized with the swaying cables, and I realized the fog reached further than I could see, slipping under the hatch edges and curling around steel beams. I could feel it brushing against the metal, like fingers seeking a way in. Obeying Rule 4 was no longer a suggestion. It was survival, a line drawn between those who returned intact and those who disappeared into the gray abyss. Hours passed slowly. I stayed by the railing, watching the fog pulse with unnatural rhythm, imagining eyes tracing me, studying my adherence to the rules. I thought about the lower deck, the humming machinery, and the distant shadows I'd observed earlier. Everything in the rig responded to the rules, to the boundaries set long before any of us arrived. The fog, dense and indifferent, seemed like a test, a living entity measuring patience and obedience. Any lapse could shift its interest from observation to interaction, and I had learned in the previous weeks that such interactions were never simple. I recalled a night when Jenkins had ignored Rule 4, peering through the fog despite warnings. He claimed he was checking the sea for anomalies, but his eyes were wide with something that wasn't curiosity. It was terror. He stepped back abruptly, muttering about forms moving against the mist, shadows that bent and twisted as though alive. That day, the hatch had slammed shut on its own, startling him enough to make him reconsider the rules entirely. Since then, no one dared to even approach the hatch when the fog was thick, understanding implicitly that the rule wasn't arbitrary. By midnight, the fog had thickened to a consistency that blurred the line between the rig and the sea. Shapes shifted in the gray haze, subtle movements that vanished the moment I tried to focus. I felt the need to call someone, anyone, to confirm that what I was seeing was real, but the radio seemed muffled, almost selective in its reception. It reminded me of Rule 4, enforcing a kind of obedience that extended beyond the physical. The fog was patient. It waited for us to make mistakes, to think ourselves braver than we were, and I realized restraint was the only shield. I paced the deck, counting lights, noting their positions, and listening to the soft, almost musical hum of distant machinery. Every once in a while, a gust of wind would sweep across the platform, bending the fog around the floodlights and casting strange shadows that weren't reflections. I felt my chest tighten, every instinct screaming that crossing the hatch's threshold could invite the unknown inside. The boundary created by Rule 4 was invisible but vital. Without it, we risked letting something from the fog step into the ordered world of steel and light. Later, I tried to imagine what lay beyond the hatch. In the dense gray of the fog, I could feel the mist pressing against the rig, curling around cables, pooling at corners, and it occurred to me that anything beyond it was impossible to quantify. Were there figures watching from within, sentient forms shaped from the very condensation, or was it merely the rig testing my restraint, teaching obedience in its own silent way? Either thought made the hair on my arms rise, and I held to Rule 4 like a mantra, each repetition grounding me against the oppressive unknown. As dawn approached, the fog thinned slightly, retreating with the first hints of sunlight. The observation hatches remained closed, and I realized the rig had survived another night because we obeyed the rules, not because we were clever. Every shadow and vibration, every subtle pulse of movement, seemed to recoil, acknowledging the boundary we had respected. I made my way back to the main control station, exhaling slowly, feeling the relief of having followed Rule 4, yet aware that the fog would return, denser, more patient, more aware, each night a test of adherence and nerve. Even as the sun rose and the world seemed calmer, I knew the fog would reclaim its patience tonight. The hatches remained closed, a thin line between us and the unknown, a reminder that curiosity could be deadly. Rule 4 was simple, yet its simplicity carried power, a lesson engraved in the bones of anyone who had ever served on this rig. Obedience was safety, and tonight I had survived, because I remembered. The rig whispered its approval, or maybe it was a warning, but either way, I was still alive to witness it. That night, I found myself staring at the blinking indicators with a knot forming in my stomach. Remembering Rule 5, never ignore the warning lights on the crane controls. The rig's cranes loomed over the deck like skeletal arms, casting long shadows across the floodlights, and every flicker of red made the steel beneath my boots seem alive. I told myself the lights were probably just faulty sensors, glitches in the old machinery. Yet instinct screamed that these signals weren't technical. They were sentient, deliberate, waiting for hesitation. Every time I tried to ignore them, I felt the vibration in the deck shift, subtle but insistent, as though the rig itself disapproved of my inattention. The first time the lights blinked for real, a gust of wind sent the cables swinging, brushing against the metal framework with sounds that mimicked whispers. I remembered Harlan's story again, how he'd ignored a similar warning and ended up trapped in a loop of machines, unable to escape the crane's reach, though he hadn't understood how. I traced the cables carefully with my flashlight, noting every sway, every quiver, every reflection in the steel, and realized that the warning lights weren't just indicators of mechanical failure. They were a communication, a way the rig enforced compliance with the rules silently but effectively. As the hours dragged on, the blinking lights became hypnotic, casting red reflections along the deck and across my face. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that old rigs had quirks and that the sensors might simply be sensitive. Yet even as I reasoned, I felt an intangible tension build around the crane, like a field of energy pressing at the edges of perception. I remembered Rule 5, whispered in my own voice like a protective charm, and approached the controls with meticulous care, knowing that the rig itself watched for any sign of negligence. Every switch I passed, every lever I examined, seemed to pulse in recognition of my attention, rewarding compliance in ways I could barely comprehend. The red lights blinked faster, and I realized I had ignored one panel momentarily while checking another. A subtle vibration ran through the deck, different from the hum of the machinery below, a low, measured tremor, almost like the rig exhaling in disapproval. My pulse quickened. I could feel the steel framework pressing against my fingertips, the cable's movements exaggerated as if testing my awareness. Even my shadow seemed to hesitate, stretching unnaturally toward the blinking crane, warning me silently not to make a mistake. Obedience was a matter of survival here, not protocol. I called out for Jenkins, hoping for reassurance, and he appeared silently at the edge of the crane deck, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. "You seeing this too?" he asked, eyes fixed on the red indicator. I nodded. "It's not just a sensor," I whispered, voice trembling. "It's aware." He didn't reply, just stood beside me, and together we traced each light, resetting panels, checking bolts, and ensuring every warning was addressed. The rig settled as we obeyed, the tension in the metal ebbing slightly. The rule was alive in the way the structure responded to us. At one point, a particularly insistent light blinked on the far crane, beyond reach without walking the catwalk. I hesitated, feeling the rule's weight. Every instinct screamed to ignore it, claiming it was minor, but my hands shook as I moved toward it. I realized then that Rule 5 was about more than safety. It was a psychological boundary, a reminder that ignoring even the smallest signal could ripple through the rig's ecosystem in ways we couldn't predict. The moment I touched the panel, the blinking ceased, and a sense of rigid calm returned, almost as if the crane itself acknowledged my adherence. The night stretched long, and I began mapping patterns, recognizing which lights blinked under certain conditions. The rig's movements synchronized subtly with the lights, the deck's vibration modulating as we worked, reminding me that this environment was alive in a way that defied logic. Each warning carried weight. The rule was both instruction and test. I repeated it silently, letting it anchor my mind as we moved methodically, covering every panel, tracing every cable, feeling the hum of awareness beneath our boots. By the time dawn crept across the horizon, the blinking had stopped. The crane stood still, shadows retracting, and the deck seemed calmer. I leaned against the railing, exhausted but aware that the rig had observed our compliance. The red lights, now dark, felt like eyes closed after inspection, and I realized that Rule 5 had kept the delicate balance intact. Ignoring them wasn't an option, not here, not on this rig, and any lapse could have consequences beyond my imagination. I walked back toward the control room with Jenkins in silence, both of us understanding without speaking that the rig had tested us and approved. The warning lights were more than mechanical signals. They were guardians, observers, enforcing boundaries we couldn't see but could certainly feel. That night, I understood the quiet importance of compliance, the subtle insistence of the rules, and how the rig shaped our survival. The hum of machinery resumed its normal rhythm, reassuring in its constancy, and I knew that the next shift would bring another test. The memory of the blinking lights stayed with me long after sunrise, and I realized that even if the indicators seemed trivial, the rig judged every act of negligence. Rule 5 wasn't about cables or cranes. It was about acknowledging the presence of something greater, unseen but aware. I felt the weight of it in my chest, a constant reminder that vigilance was essential. Even as I rested, I could sense the red glow lingering at the edges of my vision, a pulse waiting for the next night to remind me again. The first time I considered ignoring Rule 6, never enter the storage bay after the fog rolls in. I told myself it was only curiosity. The fog had thickened again, pressing against the rig's railings, curling around the floodlights, and obscuring the familiar outlines of crates and barrels stacked high across the deck. Even with every light above me glowing steadily, the storage bay seemed to recede into another world, the shadows swallowing shapes and stretching them into forms my mind refused to identify. I rationalized that I just needed to retrieve a spare part, but every instinct screamed that crossing that threshold alone, after the fog had rolled in, was dangerous. The air smelled colder here, damp with a weight that clung to my skin. I stepped closer to the hatch, the metal underfoot vibrating subtly, almost as though the rig itself disapproved. Every step toward the storage bay felt measured, each one echoing faintly, as if the deck were reminding me of Rule 6. The crates beyond the hatch seemed to shift slightly with the fog, their shadows stretching in ways that shouldn't be physically possible. I pressed my hand against the hatch frame, and for a moment the mist thickened near my fingers, curling around the metal as if it had a pulse of its own. I swallowed, forcing myself to breathe slowly, aware that disobedience here could invite consequences I didn't yet understand. The stories from older crewmen played over in my head. They described seeing forms in the fog, shadowed shapes that lingered near the crates, moving when they weren't observed and disappearing when confronted. They warned of sounds too precise, too deliberate, the faint scraping of metal that followed footsteps across the storage bay. I had once dismissed these accounts as superstition, but now, staring at the fog, I understood why the rule existed. It wasn't merely about navigation or safety. It was about respecting a boundary that extended beyond the rig, into something ancient, patient, and observant. I finally forced myself to open the hatch. The fog pressed in immediately, cold and thick, curling around the steel beams and machinery as I descended. Each step echoed faintly, but the mist seemed to absorb certain sounds while amplifying others. A creak of a crate, a shifting cable, a low vibration that resonated through the hull. I moved slowly, deliberately, reminding myself of Rule 6, even though the words were only in my mind now. My flashlight pierced the haze in thin, trembling beams, revealing shapes that stretched and flickered with every tiny movement. Somewhere in the fog, I thought I heard a whisper, subtle enough that I wasn't certain if it came from my own imagination. It was close, yet distant, carried along with the vibrations through the steel floor. I froze, feeling the mist curl around my boots, and realized that the storage bay had a rhythm of its own, one that synchronized with the fog, with the machinery, with the very presence of those who dared to enter. To disobey the rule here was to insert oneself into that rhythm uninvited, and the consequences could be unpredictable. As I moved deeper into the storage bay, the crates seemed to shift subtly, just enough to make my path uncertain. Shadows pooled along the corners, forming shapes that melted when approached. The fog was thicker here, clinging to my clothes, weaving through the crates like a living entity. My flashlight caught glimmers on the metal barrels, reflections that didn't match my movements, and I realized with a jolt that the rig itself seemed to be watching, testing my adherence to the rule. I adjusted my pace, careful to avoid sudden movements, letting the rhythm of the space guide me. I reached the section I needed, the spare parts stacked neatly on a shelf, and my hands shook as I pulled the crates closer. Every minor sound, metal scraping, cable shifting, the faint hum of a generator below, felt amplified, like the fog was listening, cataloging my compliance. I imagined what might have happened if I had ignored Rule 6 entirely, entering the bay with reckless haste. The shadows would have twisted differently, the fog would have enveloped me, and I might not have returned to the upper deck with both mind and body intact. Time seemed to distort in the fog, minutes stretched into hours as I worked, cataloging the crates, and ensuring everything was in place. Every movement was deliberate, measured, and deliberate again, like an unspoken dance between me and the rig. I whispered reminders of the rule, though the words felt almost redundant. The air itself seemed to pulse with the memory of past mistakes, of men who had disregarded the caution and paid an unknown price. I avoided looking too closely at the darker corners of the storage bay, focusing instead on the task at hand. When I finally ascended back toward the upper deck, the fog seemed to resist, curling along the stairs and stretching along the metal framework, as though reluctant to release me. I exhaled in relief when the hatch closed behind me, the light above casting familiar warmth across the deck. The rig had allowed me to return intact, and the subtle vibration beneath my boots had eased into a calm, steady hum. The lesson was clear. Rule 6 existed not only to preserve life, but to teach respect, patience, and recognition of forces beyond our understanding. Even in daylight, I could sense the lingering presence of the fog in the storage bay, subtle, patient, aware. The crates, the shadows, and the metal all carried the memory of the night's events, waiting for the next careless hand. I made a mental note to warn the next crew about the importance of following the rule exactly as it was written, knowing that even the most minor lapse could invite attention from the unseen forces inhabiting the mist. The rig itself seemed to acknowledge my compliance, a silent guardian rewarding my caution and reminding me of the delicate balance maintained by adherence to Rule 6. That night, a shiver ran down my spine as I stared at the engine pit, recalling Rule 7. Never descend into the engine pit when the lights flicker. The rig's massive generators throbbed beneath my boots, and overhead lights stuttered like nervous pulses, casting fractured shadows across the walls. I knew the rule by heart, yet fatigue and curiosity pulled me toward the ladder anyway. The vibration of the engines resonated through my chest, a low, insistent heartbeat that seemed to synchronize with the flickering bulbs. I told myself it was just a minor electrical fault, nothing more, but every instinct screamed that the rule was there for a reason. Stepping toward the ladder, the metal groaned softly under my weight, each creak echoing into the cavernous pit below. Shadows stretched long across the walls, moving subtly in the corner of my vision, and I imagined shapes writhing within the machinery itself. The flickering lights created a rhythm, a signal that I could almost feel more than see, and I knew that ignoring it could invite attention from forces beyond comprehension. My flashlight cut thin beams through the dark, and I felt the weight of the rule pressing on me, the memory of past warnings etched into my mind. I paused mid-descent, remembering Jenkins' near mistake last week, when he had ignored a flicker and leaned too close to a spinning turbine. He hadn't spoken much afterward, only muttering about shadows in the pit, shapes that weren't quite machinery, and a low vibration that seemed to hum with purpose. I hadn't believed him fully at the time, but now standing at the top of the ladder, the memory hit me with clarity. Rule 7 wasn't arbitrary, it was a protective measure, an invisible line between safety and the unknown. Every light that faltered, every shadow that stretched, served as a warning to respect that boundary. As I descended, the stuttering lights painted the machinery in uneven swaths of color. Each flicker made the shadows warp, elongate, and sometimes double, creating forms that seemed almost sentient. I held my flashlight tight, focusing on the metal walkways and bolts beneath my boots, forcing myself not to look too closely at the shapes gathering in the corners. I whispered Rule 7 under my breath, as if speaking it aloud would remind the rig that I was following the rules, that I belonged to the world of order and not to the unseen patterns lurking in the engine pit. The air down there was thick and heavy, carrying the scent of heated metal, oil, and something else faintly organic, an odor I could never place. I imagined the shadows moving along the machinery, bending into forms that mimicked human gestures before dissolving into darkness. The flickering lights above made it impossible to distinguish real movement from imagined, yet I felt an acute awareness that anything I touched, or ignored, could trigger consequences. The rule existed to preserve not just life, but sanity, a tether to reality in a space that seemed increasingly unbound by it. I reached the turbine platform and paused, careful not to touch anything unnecessary. The lights flickered again, closer this time, and I felt the vibration shift beneath my feet, like the rig itself was testing my adherence. I remembered the tales of older night mechanics, men who had ignored Rule 7 and described shadows that mirrored them, following them silently, merging and separating with the rhythm of the machinery. I tried to laugh, tried to convince myself it was all imagination, but the subtle, deliberate pulse underfoot said otherwise. Minutes stretched like hours as I checked the machinery, ensuring everything remained steady. The flickers came intermittently, casting strobing shadows that shifted with each beat of the engines. I felt eyes, or something like eyes, tracking my movements in every reflection, every polished surface, every steel girder. Rule 7 was my shield, acknowledging it was the only way to maintain a fragile control over this place. One misstep, one casual disregard of the warning lights, and I knew the pit could consume more than just time. It could consume presence, identity, and perhaps even something deeper. Eventually, I began moving back toward the ladder, each step deliberate, measured, and synchronized with the flickering lights. The shadows seemed to relax slightly as I ascended, though I could still feel them pooling in the darker corners. I exhaled slowly, the vibration under my boots, stabilizing as I returned to the upper deck. The lights above glowed steady now, and the rig seemed to acknowledge my obedience, a subtle hum of satisfaction vibrating through the structure. The rule had held, preserving the boundary and reminding me once again of its silent authority. By the time I returned to the control station, I realized how close I had come to testing the rig's patience. The light's stuttering rhythm was not just a malfunction, it was a signal, a pulse that communicated expectation, boundary, and consequence. Obeying Rule 7 wasn't about avoiding physical harm alone, it was about recognizing the rig's awareness, understanding the unseen, and respecting the invisible hierarchy of rules that govern survival here. I leaned against the console, heart still pounding, grateful that the night's lesson had been delivered without calamity, yet aware that the rig never forgot, and that the next flicker would come. The first time I heard it, I froze instantly, remembering Rule 8, never follow the dripping sounds into the dark corridors. Water had collected in strange pockets along the rig's interior, and every drip echoed like a deliberate heartbeat through the empty hallways. I could feel the vibration of the rig beneath my boots, a subtle, insistent reminder that I was being watched. The corridor ahead was swallowed in darkness, shadows pooling along the corners and stretching across the walls like reaching fingers. I told myself I only needed to check the source, just to make sure nothing was leaking. But every instinct screamed that the rule existed for a reason far beyond routine maintenance. Step by step, I advanced. Flashlight slicing thin beams through the gloom, the rhythmic drip of water guiding me like an invisible thread. Every drop seemed purposeful, echoing with subtle variations that mimicked whispers, teasing my mind with patterns I couldn't decode. I remembered the older crewmen's warnings about this corridor, men who had disappeared into the shadows, supposedly following the sound, never returning the same. The rig didn't make mistakes, and the dripping sounds weren't random. They were a lure, a test, and breaking the rule would have consequences I could hardly imagine. The corridor narrowed as I continued, each wall slick with condensation, reflecting my flashlight in fragmented glimmers. The dripping grew louder, echoing in uneven cadences, and I realized I could almost feel the vibrations aligning with my heartbeat. My mind started playing tricks, imagining figures lurking just beyond the flashlight's reach, shapes bending and stretching unnaturally in the dark. I whispered Rule 8 silently, as if saying it aloud might anchor me to the boundary I was dangerously close to crossing. The fog from the upper deck had seeped into the rig's interior, curling along the floorboards and amplifying the shadows that danced just beyond perception. I considered turning back, telling myself it was foolish, yet some morbid curiosity pushed me forward. Every drip was measured, deliberate, and seemed to echo in counterpoint to my steps. I remembered Jenkins' near disappearance months earlier, when he had ignored the rule, following the dripping to the storage bay, where he swore the shadows had reached for him. He hadn't spoken about it afterward, only shaken, and the memory alone kept me cautious. The rig seemed to pulse around me, sensing hesitation, testing resolve, and I knew the corridor had a memory, a history of men who had disobeyed and paid a hidden price. I finally reached a junction where the dripping seemed to come from every direction at once, and the echoes warped, bending against the walls and ceiling unnaturally. I held my flashlight steady, shining it across the floor, trying to anchor my senses. The darkness seemed to respond, stretching further down side passages I hadn't noticed before, as though the rig was challenging my resolve. I felt my pulse synchronize with the dripping, a slow rhythm that was both unnerving and mesmerizing. The rule existed to prevent me from losing my mind here, to preserve clarity in an environment designed to test perception itself. The shadows in the corridor began to shift subtly, aligning with the patterns of the dripping. Shapes formed just at the edges of my vision, vanishing the moment I attempted a closer look. I realized the sounds were not merely water, they were part of the rig's language, a complex signaling system that communicated danger and obedience simultaneously. I didn't touch anything, didn't move closer than necessary, whispering Rule 8 as a silent talisman. The darkness was patient, waiting for a misstep, and I felt the pressure of its attention, a presence that seemed to follow every hesitant movement I made. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I monitored the dripping and the shadows. I traced the corridor with careful, deliberate steps, noting the subtle changes in echo, temperature, and vibration. Every sound was magnified, amplified by the rig's steel and machinery, turning ordinary moisture into a signal I couldn't ignore. The fog curling into the corridor seemed to thicken with my hesitation, reminding me of the invisible boundary marked by Rule 8. Crossing it recklessly could unravel both body and mind, and I understood that the rule was not merely guidance, it was survival. Eventually, I retreated, stepping carefully back toward the more familiar sections of the rig. The dripping followed, but less insistently, the echoes diminishing as I distanced myself from the corridor. When I finally emerged into a brighter area, the hum of machinery and the vibration of the deck seemed steadier, more predictable, as though the rig approved of my restraint. I breathed heavily, aware that a single misstep could have drawn attention from something far beyond comprehension. Rule 8 had protected me, anchoring me to reality, while the shadows and dripping sounds remained patient, waiting for the next soul who dared defy its warning. Even hours later, I could feel the lingering pull of the dark corridor, a sense of awareness embedded in the air and steel around me. The dripping continued faintly, echoing through the rig in a rhythm I could never fully ignore. I understood now that the rule was absolute. It was a line between safety and the unknown, between order and the uncharted consciousness of the rig itself. Any curiosity beyond it could be fatal. Obedience was my only safeguard, and the rig would remember every decision made in that corridor, measuring vigilance, patience, and fear. The first time the rig shuddered under the assault of a storm, I felt a chill and immediately remembered Rule 9. Never descend to the lower deck during storms. Rain pounded the steel exterior, hammering against the floodlights in chaotic rhythm, and the wind whipped through the rig like angry fingers. Each gust threatened to throw me off balance, and the deck vibrated unpredictably underfoot. I wanted to check the lower deck for any loose equipment, reasoning that securing the cargo was important, but instinct screamed at me. The rule existed for a reason, one far beyond structural safety. The storm seemed alive, aware and patient, waiting for a single lapse to test compliance. I clutched the railing tightly, feeling the rig sway and groan as the wind tore along its beams. Every bolt, every cable, and every panel seemed to hum in response to the storm, vibrating beneath me with a resonance that made my bones ache. I reminded myself silently of Rule 9, the mantra echoing in my mind as the sheets of rain blurred the horizon, and the lower deck disappeared into a swirling abyss of gray. The lights overhead flickered in defiance of the tempest, casting long shadows that twisted across the deck, creating impossible shapes in every direction. I realized that the storm didn't merely threaten the rig. It tested the crew's adherence to rules, measuring obedience against instinct. I thought of Jenkins and Harlan, both of whom had tested this boundary before me. One had slipped, nearly tumbling into the rig's abyss, and the other had ignored the rule entirely, claiming he needed to check a valve. Both returned shaken, disoriented, as if the storm itself had judged them, altering perception and leaving marks on memory and mind. I had always dismissed their tales as exaggeration, but the wind now tore at my jacket, and the vibration beneath my feet resonated like a warning. The lower deck, obscured in the storm's chaos, seemed to beckon with a sinister patience, a void that waited for those foolish enough to descend. The thunder rolled like distant drums, shaking the rig and reverberating through the steel structure. The lights flickered in uneven pulses, creating strobing shadows that danced along the walls and across the catwalk. I hugged the railing, moving slowly along the upper deck, noting each sway of cables and each tremor in the metal. The storm was relentless, pressing against the rig with unseen strength, and I understood why Rule 9 existed. It wasn't about avoiding injury alone. It was about preserving sanity and life when forces far greater than human comprehension took hold. I caught glimpses of the lower deck through the sheets of rain, shadows moving across its surface, as though entities had taken root there, responding to the storm's rhythm. Every gust seemed purposeful, every strike of lightning illuminating forms that couldn't be machinery. The rig hummed beneath me in quiet approval of my restraint, vibrating in alignment with the storm while warning me of the consequences of disobedience. The rule became a lifeline, a tether connecting me to reality, as the tempest tested every instinct I possessed. Minutes stretched endlessly, each one a test of patience and vigilance. I forced myself to focus on the upper deck, tracing cables, monitoring panels, and checking locks while avoiding any glance that could lure me toward the storm-shrouded lower deck. Rule 9 repeated in my mind, not as words but as sensation, the steel beneath my boots vibrating subtly, as if reminding me of every crewman who had failed before. The shadows in the rain shifted in patterns almost too precise to be natural, and I felt a creeping awareness that the storm itself watched for mistakes. Eventually, the worst of the wind passed, though the rain continued in drizzling sheets. I exhaled slowly, feeling my muscles unclench as the rig stabilized. The lower deck remained shrouded in gray, silent and patient, holding its secrets until the next tempest. I realized that the storm had been a test, a rehearsal of obedience, and that Rule 9 was not simply caution, but a safeguard against forces that existed just beyond perception. Even as I moved back toward the control room, the memory of the storm's intensity lingered, a reminder that compliance was the only path to survival on this rig. By dawn, the winds had eased, the rig's vibration returning to its familiar hum. Yet the impression of the storm's authority lingered, embedded in the steel and in the shadows of the lower deck. I could almost hear the echo of the tempest in the distant corridors, whispering its own version of the rule, reminding me that even a single lapse could have consequences beyond comprehension. The rig had survived another night because the rules had been followed, and I was alive to witness it. The lesson of Rule 9 was clear: obedience was not optional, and storms were not merely weather, they were tests of awareness, patience, and respect. It began as a whisper, distant and almost imperceptible, yet it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I remembered Rule 10, never respond to voices echoing through the hull, as instinctively as breathing. The rig hummed beneath me, every vibration syncing with the murmur that seemed to come from deep within the steel walls, bouncing through corridors and catwalks like a living thing. My flashlight shook in my hand, and I forced myself to ignore the sounds, to tell myself it was just acoustics, machinery, or imagination. But every instinct screamed otherwise, warning me that these were not ordinary echoes. They were deliberate, probing, testing obedience. The first time I had heard the voices months ago, a junior crewman had stopped mid-step, calling back as if someone had whispered his name. He never spoke of what happened after, only that the rig seemed angry, and the corridors shifted when he obeyed the rule. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was fear, exhaustion, isolation. But standing here now, alone on the upper deck, the voices pressed at the edges of my mind, soft syllables curling along the steel, coaxing me to respond. I felt the hum of the machinery align with their cadence, a sinister synchronization that made my skin crawl. Each syllable was deliberate, like water finding cracks in the hull, small and insistent. I could imagine forms in the walls, twisting in alignment with the echoes, observing my every motion, waiting for a misstep. I whispered Rule 10 in my mind, letting the words form a shield, an anchor to reality, refusing to engage with the sounds that sought to lure me into the corridors. Every instinctive urge to answer, to acknowledge, was met with a wave of unease, a tangible reminder that obedience was survival. The rig had patience. It did not need to force compliance, only to wait for curiosity to falter. I paced along the catwalk, eyes darting across shadows that shifted with the vibration of the hull. Each step was calculated, synchronized to avoid drawing attention from whatever lurked in the echoes. The voices persisted, soft yet insistent, forming patterns almost too precise to be natural. I could imagine them bending, twisting, aligning with forms in the steel that moved in ways machinery should not. Rule 10 was simple in language, but absolute in enforcement. Acknowledging it meant survival, and ignoring it could mean being drawn into something that existed between sound and substance. Hours stretched into an endless vigilance. I moved from panel to panel, checking gauges and controls, aware of the whispers curling along the hull like living smoke. Each time the voices attempted to pull my attention, I forced focus on the tasks at hand, cataloging and tracing, moving methodically to avoid the risk of interaction. Shadows pooled in corners, elongating and contracting subtly in response to every ignored syllable. The rule had become instinctual. Obeying it felt like breathing, a rhythm that the rig recognized and allowed to continue undisturbed. I remembered the stories of older night mechanics, men who had faltered in their attention, answering softly in the empty corridors. Their voices had lingered, absorbed into the structure, leaving them changed, haunted, aware of things that could not be described. I refused to become one of them. The rig hummed under my boots, alive and attentive, reminding me of Rule 10, which acted as both boundary and lifeline. Every echo was a temptation, every vibration a potential hazard, and I resisted with every fiber of my being. Eventually, the night's rhythm settled. The whispers receded slightly, retreating into the steel walls, leaving only the low hum of machinery vibrating beneath my feet. I exhaled slowly, aware that the rig had approved my adherence, rewarding caution with calm. The voices were patient. They would wait for another shift, another unsuspecting crewman to test their resolve. The lesson of Rule 10 was clear. Survival required restraint, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to silence in the presence of temptation. By dawn, the echoes had faded entirely, leaving the rig bathed in the warm glow of early sunlight. I walked to the control station, still aware of the subtle resonance beneath my boots, a reminder that the rule had been obeyed and that I had survived another night. Even hours later, I could feel the lingering presence of the voices in the hull, faint but watchful, reminding me that curiosity here could be fatal. Obedience was the only guarantee, and the rig measured every choice with patient scrutiny. I had always dreaded the final rule, and tonight, as darkness fell like a heavy blanket over the deck, I recalled Rule 11, never leave the rig after nightfall. The horizon was swallowed by black, the floodlights barely piercing the void, and the fog from the upper deck curled around the edges of the platform like slow-moving smoke. Every shadow seemed exaggerated, bending unnaturally, forming impossible shapes that my mind couldn't categorize. The wind pressed against my face, carrying whispers of the rig's previous occupants, a reminder that the world beyond the steel and lights was patient and merciless. Stepping near the rail, I felt the pull of the unknown, the allure of leaving the rig for open water, where the sea and night merged into one endless darkness. I shook my head, remembering the tales of men who had ignored the rule, disappearing into the blackness without a trace. Rule 11 wasn't about safety from waves or wind. It was about respecting boundaries no human was meant to cross. My flashlight reflected off the wet metal, creating faint illusions of movement, and I realized that the rig itself enforced the rule, a silent guardian that waited for defiance. The night was still but alive, vibrating subtly under my boots. Every creak of the rig, every distant thrum of machinery, resonated like a heartbeat, reminding me that the steel held memories and awareness. I imagined the fog rolling in, stretching beyond the lights, reaching for anyone who dared defy the rule. The thought made my pulse quicken. Rule 11 was not negotiable, not optional. It was the final line between life and the unknown. Crossing it meant surrendering to forces that were patient, deliberate, and infinitely aware. I thought of Jenkins, Harlan, and the others, each tested by the rig in different ways, each shaped by obedience or punished by curiosity. The night beyond the deck was a void that swallowed rules, stretching reality, twisting perception, and I felt a deep unease at the thought of stepping into it. The rig seemed almost to breathe, its vibrations matching the racing of my heart. I whispered the rules silently, anchoring myself to the known, to the steel beneath my boots, and to the boundaries that had kept me alive until now. Hours passed in tense silence. I watched the shadows stretch, watched the fog curl along the catwalk, and every instinct urged me to retreat further inside, away from the rail, away from the temptation. The rig hummed approval underfoot, a subtle vibration acknowledging my adherence, a quiet reminder that the rule was absolute. I realized that Rule 11 encompassed all the others. It was the final safeguard, a barrier between the ordered world of steel and light, and the chaotic abyss that waited patiently for any who stepped beyond the limits. The wind shifted, carrying strange echoes from the horizon, faint and distant but impossibly clear. I imagined what lay beyond, a black expanse full of uncharted entities, forms that defied human comprehension. The rig remained my anchor, but I understood why the rule existed. The night had no mercy, and the world outside was not meant for the living. Rule 11 demanded obedience, patience, and respect for boundaries that were invisible yet enforced with precision. I stood motionless, aware that every step I didn't take mattered more than any step I might have taken. Even as dawn hinted at the horizon, the rig seemed to watch me, reminding me that the rule was eternal, that its patience outlasted humans, storms, and even fog. I exhaled slowly, feeling both relief and an unshakable dread, knowing that breaking the final rule would not just end a shift, It could erase existence in ways no mind could comprehend. Every shadow, every hum, every vibration was a reminder that obedience had kept me alive, but the rig's awareness did not sleep, and the darkness beyond waited. By the time the sun began to rise, casting pale light across the deck, I realized I had survived the night. But the black horizon remained a warning, the fog still curling in anticipation, and the lesson of Rule 11 was etched into my bones. Leaving the rig after dark was not merely dangerous, it was impossible to survive. The other 10 rules had led me here, but the 11th was the boundary I could never cross, a final line drawn between life and the infinite unknown that whispered beyond the steel. I stayed inside, watching the horizon, listening to the hum of machinery, and feeling the rig's patient vigilance beneath my feet. I understood now that the rules were not arbitrary. They were survival, guidance, and protection all at once. Every night would bring new tests, new temptations, but the rules remained, and obedience was the only guarantee. And yet, as I watched the distant fog curl beyond the lights, I knew one thing with certainty: the rig had memory, and the darkness beyond waited for anyone foolish enough to forget the 11th rule. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.